Hello once again, I'm brschultz. Thank you for joining me. It is the end of week number 5 as we head into the weekend here. Next week is week number 6 of 2024. This is my weekly S&P 500 forecast. So, the prediction since the beginning of January was that there was going to be a major peak in markets, a macro peak in markets, if you will, in early February of 2024. And then midterm, we would crash into late March. And so we've made about 5 waves up now. In early 2024, we sold off in early January, and that was kind of the end of that last cycle. And then we've had 5 waves up, I believe, since that early January low and into this early February peak. So I believe that's what's ultimately going to lead to this peak on one of the fronts. And then you can see at the bottom here that I believe that the Great Depression is going to start in 343 weeks, which is roughly Labor Day of 2030. And then in the background in the red wave, you can see that roughly that's the icon that I'm using for the thumbnail for this video. So I believe that the markets will hit their ultimate peak. So election will come along this year in late 2024, and then markets rocket and hit their final ultimate peak. They bubble up to 1999 or 2000 type of feeling into 2000. The S&P gets some grandiose peak around Labor Day of 2030, and then we have economic darkness or a depression, Great Depression, from what I believe will be 2031 into 2035, and possibly into 2037. I think the second leg down will be into late 2037. So you'd see the whole market get wiped out basically into October of 2035, and then it would start back up in 2036, and then it would crash again into late 2037 for wave 2 down on the macro scale. So it's going to be like a 100-year cycle or whatnot, but I'll show you a little bit about that in today's episode as well. I've turned this more into like a TV program. I've created a plethora of slides and essentially put on this show for about an hour. So thank you for joining me. And the commercials are basically the viewers, right? So if you want to donate or whatnot, you can use the icons or whatever in the presentation there to donate if you want to support my work, if you enjoyed it, if you think it's some of the most accurate timing that is available in the whole worldwide arena, then please feel free to donate if you'd like. Let's start moving on. So I believe that the Great Depression again is going to start around Labor Day of 2030, and this is basically my Federal Reserve peak algo, and then I use it to identify peaks in the future. And so I believe that this is calling out the Labor Day peak of 2030. So you can kind of see how I've arrived at that. Last time I updated this was in January, so I'll update this every so often. But for those of you who are new that wonder how I get to my Great Depression projection, this is one of the graphs I use, and I think I have another one next up to show you again. But I think the Great Depression starts around Labor Day 2030 in about 343 weeks. This is my next major macro peak model. It doesn't really say peak anywhere, does it? No, but it is the peak model, and essentially you can see almost how the black wave, if you take the trend line and drop it off the bottoms of the black wave, it actually calls out major peaks in markets. So it called out the peak in 2000, and then if you drop it off the bottom, the black trend line there, if you do take it off the bottom of the black wave, it calls out the peak at the end of 2007. And then usually I use 3 touch points is my methodology, but that doesn't really utilize 3 touch points. Although in 93, 94, you can see that the black wave kind of took some time to bounce back up. And so usually when it stalls like that, I call that a two touch point wave dip or peak. So essentially you're seeing that the black wave bottomed in 1978, hit those two touch points in 93, 94 roughly, and then that's what caused the peak in late 2007. So essentially you have three touch points into Labor Day 2030 here on the top, and then you also have three touch points on the bottom into Labor Day 2030. So I believe that's what's ultimately going to cause the Great Depression, is you get these harmonics within the economy that I believe are heavily dependent upon how the Federal Reserve is injecting liquidity into markets, propping up markets. It's in my opinion, it's 85% to 97, 98%, primarily driven by the Federal Reserve. It's not a president. It's not so much Congress. I think it's primarily driven by the Federal Reserve, because they have so many levers nowadays that they can control so much that you can see after 2000 actually how the waves became much more smooth, round. There's not a lot of breakage in them. It doesn't like shift a little bit in between the peak and the valley like you see in like late 80s. You kind of see how the black wave kind of moves back and forth, gyrates a little bit, but it seems now that the waves are much more rounded, much more smooth. So I believe that the Federal Reserve is responsible for creating market collapses now and bottoms as well in the future. So again, I think you'll see a major economic peak in late 2030. I think things will be like 1999 all over again. The sky's the limit, so to speak. We rocket to the moon, if you will, in late 29, early 2030, and then markets again go into a Great Depression from 2031 into 2035. I think it's going to be a very rough time worldwide, and so I think that's also why you're seeing a lot of the politicians get paid off by some of the big donors to try to crush the masses, changing the retirement age and things of that nature. If you think about the interest rates were at 0% going into 2020, they could have easily fixed a lot of the retirement programs, Social Security, things of that nature. Congress could have stepped in and just done that snap of the fingers, right? Not had a problem with that. Why interest rates were zero, but you notice that it's never taken place, right? So unfortunately, I think it's intentional and it's on purpose what's taking place. And those that are, I think, that pay attention to politics and that nature can kind of sense that it's more or less, unfortunately, something that is being pushed upon the public, trying to push the retirement age out to the life expectancy date. I don't think it's fair. I think instead of going into some of these conflicts and wars around the world and sending all of our money worldwide, they could have fixed our Social Security. They could have fixed a lot of different programs. But I think that's eventually what's going to lead to the Great Depression, is there won't be any money for anyone after 2030. And I doubt there will be any jobs too. So unfortunately, every one of these major drawdowns in the market on this scale usually lead to job losses, right? So maybe we have 30% of the middle class wiped out or more in the next Great Depression from 2031 through 2035 is my anticipation. So that's kind of the high-level macro view for this episode, and so we'll start diving down into the lower levels now. Thank you for joining me. This is a 60-minute monthly model, so I put monthly data in, and then I've added these lower-level zigzag models to my episodes, you'll notice. And so essentially I have a 1, 2, 3 on a monthly scale. So basically that's pointing out that there should be a major peak in markets. On the 60-minute models, algorithms, the peaks are usually drawn all the way to the top of the graph. On the daily zigzag, you draw to the 50, or that black horizontal line at the around that 3. That's drawn there, that black line. So that's a little bit of the difference between taking purely the data on a whole or a round lot, a full day, let's say, or a whole number, versus applying like a 60-minute algorithm or a 30-minute algorithm, where there's some kind of logic being applied in the background. So essentially, this is saying that the market looks like it's ready to have a big decline. Also, you can note that the graph was stuck to the bottom of the graph in July through August in this model, and so then it popped up very strongly when the markets dropped that 10% into late October 2023, and now you can see that's kind of like wave one down, if you will, in terms of thinking of markets. And then when the markets pop back up, that's what created this zigzag line then to drop back down. So that's your wave two up in markets on a macro scale, and then markets would collapse on wave three. So I think we're going to see like a 5-wave pattern into, I believe, maybe like October timeframe. Maybe it takes 9-10 months for this to unwind fully to do like a 5-wave. So you can kind of look back at 2021, if you will. Like 2021, it was stuck to the floor, then it popped up to break it, and then dropped back down. So that was wave two down in the model, and then then wave three was from the beginning of 2022. So the market crashed into March, pulled back down into early April, and then crashed into late September. Or sorry, that's July. So I had 5 waves down into July, and then if you remember, August was very strong. So that's where you see this model pull back down into that point number 2 that's drawn, and then the drawdown was then into October. So that's that pop back up. So that's where markets were starting to get going again, if you will. I know this model is flipped upside down, so it's a little bit difficult to explain it, but you can kind of see the 5-wave patterns that are going on here, essentially. So essentially, again, focus on, also look at the end of 2019. So you had like a 5-wave structure into the end of 2019. So at the very top of the graph, you can see it there in early 2019, right? So it's stuck at the very top of the graph. Then wave 1 down would be all the way down into June of 2019. So that's wave 1, and then wave 2 up, wave 3 down, wave 4, and then 5 would be into the end of 2019. So if you think about it in reverse, the markets made 5 movements up on a monthly scale into the end of 2019, January of 2020, and that's what caused the markets to collapse in February of 2020. That's why it was such a critical point in the model. Again, so the model was able to understand that in that 5-wave type of movement, and so I believe, again, we're in like a 5-wave movement of a market crash into late 2024. Now it could crash all the way into July, right, or something like that. That could be the end of wave 5 on a monthly scale, and then you could have 1 up and then 2 down into October, right? So that when the election comes along, that's wave 3 up or something like that, right? So it could look a lot like late 2021 through end of 2022. So I'll also try to update this every week as well, so that you have an understanding what wave we're in. That's why I'm trying to make this more into a TV episode. Thank you. Let's move on. If you'd like to donate, you can use the PayPal QR code here or the Venmo QR code. Okay, now I guess starting to get a little bit more fun. So I kind of walked you through how the model worked on the 5 waves on the large scale, and then markets collapse. And so this is also a different way of looking at it. So that blue teal wave, essentially you can see all the touch points going into the top of the graph where again markets peaked roughly around Thanksgiving of 2021. That's when the Fed said he was going to start finally tightening after all the inflation he claimed was transitory. It was completely wrong, and I believe is intentional. Again, I don't think that the Fed's really ever not knowing what's going on. I think the Fed's very well aware and very well in the know. I don't think they ever really think that they're wrong. I think they purposefully say what they say and pretend they're wrong, unfortunately. So the Fed, again, the teal blue wave up into Thanksgiving of 2021, then the markets start dying out there. And then you can see the green trend line at the bottom hitting all those touch points on that dark blue wave in the background, that zigzaggy wave. you can see how that climbed up into that lower black trend line into mid-October of 2022. So markets peaked, if you will, on a macro scale at the end of 2021, and then they didn't hit their bottom until October of 2022. So again, that was like that 10-11 month window. So why is that important? Well, let's move on to the next slide, and I'll show you why that's important. You may need to flip back to this slide, look at this again, but essentially this is how I'm predicting that this is the macro peak in a market, and then on the macro bottoms in the future. Just those two trends, okay? Just to give you a little prep. So this is what is the economic blackout that I believe is coming for 2024. Again, you see that same yellow dash trend line, all those touch points going out to roughly now, right? Early February 2024. So again, I believe the markets are topping out here. And again, as I've said before, it seems that markets like to peak every 1,650 points to 1,700 points. So we peaked in 2007, I think, around the 1,600 point level, 1,650, I can't remember exactly the number, or maybe it was 2,000. And then markets peaked again in early 2020 at 3,400, so 17 and 17 is 34. And then our 17 or 1,650 on top of that is around your 5,000 level. So that's right where we're at right now. So, but again, the same trend line that you saw in the previous graphic, and you can scroll back the tape. You can see all the touch points. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 touch points here. And then that's predicting that the macro peak in the markets would occur in early February of 2024. Now we do have another peak out in the future, as I've stated in other slides, so we'll get to that a little bit later, but this is the first macro peak, so I would expect that the pretty soon that the momentum starts dying here, and then you can see from that dark blue or that bright blue trend line at the bottom, it has the 3 touch points, much like the green line. So the green line had 3 touch points going out to mid-October of 2022, and that's where markets finally hit their bottom. Well, the same thing is true of the bright blue diagonal in this as well, right? You see 3 touch points, and it's going out again into roughly mid-October, late October of 2024. So if the graph is extremely repetitive and aligned with the last graph, then I would assume that we're hitting the macro peak here in early February 2024 in markets, and then you'll see markets decline or go sideways into October of 2024 when they hit their final bottom. So I think markets are in a kind of a blackout period for the next 8, 9, 10 months until the election, essentially. All right. Yeah, so this is interesting. You may want to keep this, jump back between this graph and the last graph. You can do a comparison, yada, yada, yada. And essentially this is the same graph just zoomed in. This is one you saw last week. And so if you're familiar more with this one, you can see how the model is predicting a major peak in early February, and again, I believe that will last until the weakness in markets will last until October when they finally bottom, leading for a Christmas rally in 2024. Looks like once again. So again, I think that the macro peak is roughly here in time in early February of 2024 for markets. Okay, so this is the weekly version of the zigzag, and again, that green box is empty, so basically there's no time algorithm on a scaling basis for the weekly data. It's just pure weekly data in the zigzag model. And again, you can see all the touch points, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Essentially, it called out the macro peak in September of 2018 with the dark blue trend line, and then again the yellow trend line, 1, 2, 3, going into the end of 2019. So that created a crash in markets in Q1 of 2020. And again, I think the Fed is responsible largely for most of these crashes, 95% of them. Then you have the green trend line, dash line that picked out the peak at the end of 2021. And you can see it really starts getting jumbled and congested. But then you can see the teal blue line that's going out to roughly right here as well in time. So I believe the markets are in wave. This is wave 2 down, and then I think wave 3 up is a crash in markets. So I think markets at a very vulnerable point here in early February 2024, and could have a very big crash. And you can see how in the past when the markets, the model stuck to the bottom and had those 3 touch points or on the trend line as well, it can create quite a crash. So I think the next graph is a zoom in on that. So basically I just zoomed in on the weekly zigzag model. You can see the 3 touch points pretty clearly. The green wave basically saying that was the green trend line basically saying that was the peak at the end of July, early August, and then the market crashed into October, and then it's popped back up here. Again, the model's inverted because it's a peak model, so it's upside down. And so now I believe we have the 1, 2, 3 touch points into this time frame. So I think we're at a very critical point where markets could collapse. And then I found this golden oldie in my portfolio of models, and essentially the black wave I used in the historically to call out peaks, but then I had a green wave in the background that I brought to light, and basically it's saying the same thing once again, that you get these 2 touch points, the peaks in the green wave, I take a trend line out to the top, and essentially call out the peak in late December of 2021, and you can see that there's roughly 3 touch points, right? Because the green wave in August through October, it kind of flattened out there, so you can kind of, so 1, 2, 3, and that trend line basically goes out to about right now. And so again, this is my belief that markets are at some type of major peak here, a macro peak, and then markets would top out here. So this is another model I use to try to look at more of a macro scale, but it would also agree with some type of major crash happening here in markets. This is the daily model you're used to seeing, I think, in the last episode. Basically, it called out the peak in late 2021, called out the peak in late March of 2022, called out the peak in mid-August 2022, called out the peak in mid-February 2023. But that's only 2 touch points, if you will, if you look at the zigzag. And then we have 3, 4 touch points into roughly now of 2024. So you can see how each one of these touch points has caused a major peak in the market, and then markets crash, right? The oddball is that there looks like a peak in early March, and I think I've said that before. And so I think that's what's going to could throw a wrench into the mix. Essentially, the early March peak date, I believe, is going to be Super Tuesday, which falls on March the 5th. So that's where I think there's going to be another peak in the market. So if you remember last video, I believe markets are going to sell off into roughly February 20th through 23rd. And then they're going to bounce back up into early March. And I think that early March peak will be Super Tuesday. And this is just a zooming in of the model, essentially showing that there should be a peak roughly right about here. I'm going into February 6th, so I think there'll be a peak here, and then again another peak around early March, which again I think will be Super Tuesday, that March 5th. This is a hourly model, so again you draw the diagonals to the top of the model, and essentially you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 into the end of December. You can see that pretty clearly with the denoted by the yellow numbers. And then you can see a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going into roughly again that February 6th. Now there is a little bit of shift in the model when you refresh it from day to day. So the 60-minute periods are not perfectly identified in the model. It's more, it just shifts by 30 minutes because the days start at 9:30. So it does shift a tiny bit. So again, looking for a major peak very soon in the markets. So if the markets peak or stay strong or top out, stay flat into February 6th, it would be a bullseye. That would be a perfect call. Let's keep moving. And then this one I just zoomed in a little bit more, so if you want to see that, you can see it. So you don't have to scroll the video to the side or try to zoom in or anything, snip it. Basically, I just zoomed in for you here. If you want to look at it for a second, you can see the 5 touch points. Basically going into a major peak roughly here very soon in early February. Then I thought this was pretty cool. This is the 2-hour model algorithm. Basically had 1, 2, 3 touch points and 3 touch points roughly into the end of December, and it has 3 touch points as you can see into around that February 6th time frame. So you know we're seeing the strength into today roughly, and so I believe that this will be the market peak very soon. Again, February 6th would be a bullseye of a bullseye, so that'd be 100% accuracy, even more so. I get a 1-day window either way, so for the model at 100% accuracy is plus or minus 1 business day. So that being February 5th through 7th is kind of my 100% window, but a perfect peak would be on February 6th. And then this is a 60-minute weekly model. And so basically this also kind of shows you how I believe that on a weekly scale, using the zigzag method, that markets peak roughly around here in early February, and then it does a really good job actually of showcasing the very early March peak as well. So I think that there will be a major peak in markets in early March. So you can kind of see the 1, 2, and looking for wave number 3 down into late February here as well. You know, because it got stuck to the bottom of the graph and into late December, and then the market sold off into early mid-January, and that caused the model here to pop and then drop. So that's wave 2 down in the model, and then wave 3 up would be into roughly that February 20th to 22nd. So if we're going to see a major collapse in markets, it would be between now and that February 23rd time frame, I believe. And then you're going to see one more big spike in the market, I believe, into March 5th. And then this gets a little bit hectic, so I won't spend much time on it, but basically it's like 5 touch points into that March 5th time frame. But again, it's kind of hectic, so I'd not paying a lot of attention to this. And then again, you may remember this graph. Basically, there's 4 touch points here in the 30-minute model going into roughly, again, that February 6th time frame that I've been, this model I haven't updated it, but basically you're seeing the same thing that I've shown you weeks past. Basically saying that there is anticipated to have a market peak around roughly now, but the specific 100% bullseye would be, or hole in one would be on February 6th. But yeah, so this is basically how I got to my conclusion week after week after week. You can go back and look at the videos if you want, and you basically find the same graph. And then you may remember this graph from last time, essentially also showcasing like the early March peak, and also proposed peak roughly on February 6th as well. Again, then if you'd like to donate, support these videos, feel free. This is the 15-minute S&P 500 model. I've shown this in the past, basically also pointing to roughly February 6th for the market peak. So I feel that we're very close. I'll just skim past this though, because I've shown it weeks past. And again, this is the 10-minute, 30-minute algo So I took my 10-minute algorithm, and then it has a little 30 next to it, and I applied a 30-minute algo to the 10-minute period. So essentially I took away the 10-minute algo and applied the 30-minute algo and overrode the 10-minute algorithm. Essentially you got 4 touch points going into, again, that roughly the February 6th time frame. So it was looking for a macro peak very soon. This is one of my original peak models. Basically, it's a bottom model, right? So you're looking at the SH, and you have the 3 or 4 touch points here, basically calling for a major market peak or bottom and shorts around the 6th again. So this is what I used to use for peaks before I had all the other peak models. And again, this was one of the original peak models as well, 30-second peak model. I haven't updated this either, but you can see how it's called out a peak roughly now, actually. Even though I haven't updated it, you can see how accurate it is over time. And essentially, you're seeing that it's coming true as markets maintain strength into roughly now. So this is, let's see here, what is this? This is the peak model. It's a 5-minute period with a 30-minute algorithm applied to it. Essentially, the green waves, when carried up to the top of the graph, had produced a pretty accurate peak call. So you saw it at the end of December, and then you saw it near, you see it around February 6th time frame. So very soon. And then also calling it for a peak around March 5th. Through the 1 through 2, 3 touch points you can see on the green graph as well. So pretty cool, huh? So I thought that was pretty interesting that it went out to March 5th as well. So again, we would see a peak here roughly, and then markets would drop into February 20th through 23rd. And this is my 1-minute peak model, my Federal Reserve algorithm that I use for calling out peaks. And essentially you have 6 touch points. I think we touched on this last time. Essentially, again, calling out for a major peak in markets roughly on February 6th. So again, that February 6th keeps getting driven home. So this is a zigzag model on a 10-minute time frame, essentially, and it's using the same principles as the 60-minute algorithm. Essentially, it called out the peak roughly on January 30th, and then it's calling out a peak roughly on February 6th. And so basically it doesn't always give some type of signal, but I want to use this in conjunction with the macro model so that it kind of fine tunes it and gives you a better estimate. So yeah, so this is kind of where I came to my conclusion at for the peak of Feb 6 as well. Okay, so this is a 60-minute model, essentially also showing 3 touch points into roughly February 6th, though. This has a nice touch, a very clean touch point, 1, 2, 3 to it. So again, to me it looks really good. So I have to see how it plays out, but very nice touch points. This is the 2-minute peak model, and essentially you can see all the peaks it's calling out. It's calling out a peak on at the end of December through 3 touch points in that green trend line, and then the orange line also picks around February 6th, and then there's a teal line that goes out to March 5th as well. So that's where I believe all the peaks will fall, roughly there. And you can see at the bottom, it picks out the bottoms of the market. So the next bottom I think will be around the Fed date in late March. This is the 10-minute algorithm. I believe it does a pretty good job of picking out or showcasing where it believes the next bottom will be. I think this will occur in roughly that final full week in December or February. I think around the 22nd, 23rd, somewhere in there. I'll get it more fine-tuned when I get closer. But essentially, I think this is the 30-minute algorithm that's applied to the 10-minute model, even though it doesn't show it in the legend. I think that's what's happening here. So again, I think the markets will peak around the February 6th time frame, and then I think you'll see then the bottom around the February 22nd, 23rd pop up into March 5th, and then drop into late March. So let's keep moving. Okay, so this is the 1 minute peak model for SH, the short. Again, it's on a different scale. I think it's at a 150 scale. So for the 1 minute model, for some reason it likes to have that higher level peak date. So again, this says that the shorts will peak around the 22nd, 23rd as well. That's what this is predicting. So this is basically how I confirm some of my other calls. This is my 30-minute model, bottom model. You can see the 1, 2, 3 touch points into late October 2023. And you can see the 1, 2, 3 touch points into roughly the Fed date in late March for the bottom as well. And this is another way of looking at bottoms, essentially when it has 2 touch points into the bottom of the market. And basically it called out the bottom in March of 2023, the end of October 2023, and it's calling out a bottom markets around the Fed date of 2024. I haven't updated this model since the last time. Essentially this is showcasing a projection in the markets for a bottom around March 21st as well. This is a 2-hour model, essentially using 3 touch points, picks out the major bottoms in markets. You can see the 3 touch points on the purple wave from mid-November 2022 through July of 2023, essentially also calling out for some type of major bottom in markets around the Fed date in late March 2024. Again, if you find these episodes to be of high quality and high value, please feel free to donate by scanning the QR codes. This model essentially has touch points out to the 25-point trend lines, and essentially you're seeing that this also calls out for a major bottom in markets around the late March timeframe, around when the Fed meets. This is where it all started, essentially, for when I found out that the zigzag could be used to call out bottoms and peaks through the touch points, the 3 touch points. And essentially you're seeing 3 touch points on the green graph for roughly, again, for that Fed date. And then you're also seeing the yellow trend line has 3 touch points for, again, that late February date. So it's interesting how all the peaks are roughly 30 calendar days apart, right? So we had a peak in around February 5th, and then a peak around March 5th, and then a peak around, or bottom around February 22nd, and then a bottom around March 22nd. So a very rhythmic bottom and peak series or sequence, it would seem. And so this is the weekly zigzag model, essentially showcasing the 3 touch points into the late March low time frame. And yeah, so I've come to this week's video to under 45 minutes, under 40 minutes if you will. So I thank you for joining me. Thank you for viewing my work again. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Hopefully you're drawing information out of it. Hopefully I'm filling in the gaps. And for those that are not familiar with the graphs, completely understand how it's highly technical. I hate sitting through a 2-hour highly technical graphs of the stock market because I feel like they just look at 1,000 different tickers, and you don't really know if anything they say is going to come true. So I believe the value in my work is I always try to keep it about the same ticker, right? I keep it about the S&P 500 index, and I try to always tell the same story through a number of different models so that you can see how I come to my conclusion and my timing. And so hopefully I've made at least a clear case for an early February peak, and then a drop into roughly February 20th through 23rd, and then a peak around March 5th, and then a bottom in markets around March 21st, with a caveat that we could be at a macro peak based on some of the first slides I showed of the macro peak being in early February, possibly for the entire year. And yeah, so hopefully you've enjoyed another weekly video. Until next week, I'm brschultz, and take care.